Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the office for part two of our introduction to Plato and Aristotle and sort of the comparison between the two when it comes to the concept of rhetoric, particularly in regards to communication theory. So I'm just going to jump right back in. When the book introduces Aristotle, they start off with a quotation from C.S. Lewis, the famous author, and that quotation is about how rhetoric has separated us from our history, from our ancestors. And it's sort of the same argument that Plato made, that rhetoric can change anything that we want it to change. It can change the truth. Now, you might think, boy, that's great, lovely. I don't study history. I don't care how would this apply to me. But let me give you a very serious and current application. One of the things that's driving me nuts right now is this talk about critical race theory in our high schools and our middle schools. And the reason it drives me nuts is because you don't do a theory. That's not how this works. So you're not doing CRT. And critical race theory is actually pretty specific to legal issues. But let's ignore that for a second and just say what they're trying to do is, well, in my opinion, noble. What they're trying to do is attempting to get people to realize that our histories were written by people who were flawed, but who also made choices about what our history was going to say. And some of those choices were just flat out wrong. I mean, just flat out wrong. They're just inaccurate. If you want to start with Christopher Columbus discovering America, that's a very simple one. I mean, it's called America, not Columbia. There's a reason for that. And the reason is that Christopher Columbus did not establish America, North America or South America, honestly. Instead, it's named after Amerigo Vespucci. And even before he found it, of course, there were arguments about the Vikings landing on the northern shores and sort of moving down the land to find warmth and food and so on. And that's why a lot of people of Scandinavian or Nordic descent live in Minnesota, for example. That's a great story. But we also all know, especially living in the area that we do, that there were people here long before any of that. And just because you're born in a place doesn't mean that it's not yours. You don't have any right to it. And just because somebody else landed on it and decided to take it, well, that's just called imperialism. That's not really a legal claim, right? We've talked about that already. So when people say that they're interested in bringing CRT into the schools, what they're really saying is we want history to be taught as we are learning what history really is, not what people before us have wanted us to believe. But as we learn more, we understand better where our story came from and what the real quote unquote true story is. Okay. And we can have that play out in all kinds of data. For example, my bonus daughter, my stepdaughter, my bonus daughter and I decided to do Ancestry.com DNA because she wanted to, quote, know where she comes from. I was like, well, you come from Farmington, Arkansas. That's not that hard. But she wanted to know, like, what her history was. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't know what all I was going to find. I only knew my husband's, traces. And so I was sort of like, well, you look like your dad, so I imagine you have a lot of this in you. And it turns out she does. She is a walking definition of a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Well, she's not Protestant. She's not anything yet. She's only 12. But she looks the part, blonde hair, big blue eyes, perfect skin. And she just looks the part. She looks just like her father. So this is an interesting point of fact, though, I think. Well, at least for me, it was. I have a grandfather that I was told was 100% Irish, and my grandmother was 100% Italian. This is on my mother's side. Now, Italians and Irish did not marry in the United States of America when they were together, but they did. Also, she was a Catholic and he was an Orange Irish, so he was Protestant Irish. There's just a lot going on there that was problematic for them in the my mom was born in 48, so somewhere in the early 1940s to mid 1940s. So I thought, well, when I open mine up, it's clear that I'm going to have very strong Italian and Irish ties. But my father's side just claimed all to be Slovak. It's like, what does that mean? And the answer is really interesting because I knew this before. He would say I'm Czechoslovakian, and people would say that's not possible. Well, there were 36 years, I believe it was 36 years, that Czechoslovakia existed as a country in of itself, and roughly. And my great-grandfather, left the Hungarian Empire, the Czechoslovakian country during that time. So when we say we're Czechoslovakian, we mean it. Literally, we are. We come from all parts of what is sort of called the Pan-Slavic movement, if you will. So I'm thinking, I got this all figured out. I know exactly what it's going to come back with. To say I'm a mutt is being like really derogatory to mutts. I mean, I've got so much stuff in me. I don't even know how it is that all these came together. And how much Irish do I have? 1%. And my brother John, who looks just like an Irishman, the typical reddish hair and freckles and the pale skin, that whole deal. And he's 12% Irish. So we really were baffled by how granddad's lineage could have gotten so screwed up, right? Well, it turns out that the last name was English, and we were part of the English people that came over to Ireland into County Down and County Antrim and married the women, apparently, and then moved to America later. We actually came over here long before the famine and things like that, so it was really a long time ago. But when you have a name like Bradford and it's supposedly Irish, yeah, you expect that maybe there's a little bit of English in there. Like, there's Scotch, there's Nordic, there's so many different things thrown in there that I am more of than Irish, which I find fascinating. And the same thing happened on the Italian side. Yes, we're from Calabria. Great. That's fantastic, except only one small piece of the family's from Calabria. Some of them are from Sicily. And the idea of Italians and Sicilians getting along is a little bit weird. And my great-grandmother was married to an Italian, and then he died and she married a Sicilian. So things got really, really, really messed up for us along the way. And so when I get my history, my ethnic makeup, you expect there's going to be maybe 3 or 5 regions that you come from. I've got like 16, right? What happened there? Well, what happened there is the story that we're told about who we are and where we come from, our history, our ancestors, etc. One of the ways that those things get messed up is that people just want to make it easier and say, well, we're from Ireland. That's where we came in from the boat. That's where we're from. But that's not necessarily the ancestral lineage. Another thing is when you have a situation like we do in the Slavic regions, where there's new countries being created and then dying, and some countries coming together and then splitting apart, and civil wars and everything else, that, if you talk about Czechoslovakia, you've got German, Austrian, Hungarian, Czechoslovakian, Czech, Slovakian, Slovenia, Bosnia. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff in there. And so actually a lot of Russian as well. So I'm actually more Russian than I am Irish. And I'm more Russian than I am Italian. So talk about crazy, right? Like that's nutty. Where did this all come from? What don't I know about my family's history? I'll tell you one small thing just to keep us from falling asleep. If you are already falling asleep, I apologize, but maybe this will wake you up. When I was growing up, I was always told that Dudash meant royal hornblower, as in we were the people that, played the trumpets for the king and for royalty. And I believed that story because, like, why wouldn't you? That sounds nice. Oh, we're the Dudashes. We used to play for royalty. I have no musical talent at all whatsoever, and that should have been my first suspicion. But I was at MSU, and this was in about 2015. And I was standing in line for some sort of buffet for an event we were having. And this woman in front of me, I had seen her before. I knew she taught, but I didn't know what. And she said, "Oh, well, what's your last name?" And I said, "Dudash." And she said, "Oh, little Piper. So, little Piper, what are you talking about? The name Dudash does not translate to royal hornblower. It translates to street piper, basically someone who plays a little miniature pipe. Not to be outdone, my aunt, who was divorced from my uncle for many, many years, met a man and she married him recently. And his last name is Gatos. And that means pipe player as well. But the story I'm getting is that Dudash means one who plays the pipe well, and Gatos means one who plays the pipe not well. I imagine that's also a made-up story, don't you? So the point is that not this is not, anybody's fault in the sense of, okay, there was a bunch of people who got together and decided this was our history. That's the Catholic Church. Their history was kind of done that way. I don't know about other churches, but I know that the history of the Roman Catholic Church, for example, which we're going to be getting into because we're hitting the Roman Empire very, very soon, they dictated their entire history. And we know that it's not all correct. And we know that things are left out and that there are interpretations just in that religion. I'm not even talking about like a faith of Christianity. Just in that religion, you could poke holes in it because there's so many inaccuracies. So and not just inaccuracies, but also contradictions, which is what my family has. We have a lot of contradictions in my family. Turns out my grandfather's grandfather, so my great-great-grandfather, something like that, was not a Dudash. He was, he may have been, but we don't know. He actually adopted his, he lived with an uncle and he adopted his last name. We don't know if it was a maternal uncle, a paternal uncle, whether it was a different name. We have no idea. So maybe I'm not supposed to be Dudash. Maybe I'm supposed to be a Kennedy. No, I'm just kidding. That would be cool though. But no, our history gets told to us orally, right? It's handed down orally in the early years and it could get messed up. It's like a game of telephone sometimes, right? Which is why all of the ancestry stuff that my uncle and my father-in-law are obsessed with, they track the true stories, using bloodlines and so on. And you got to take your pick. What do I want to talk about? Do I want to talk about my family the way that I want it to come out being, or do I want to talk about where we're actually from? Same thing with critical race theory. Do we want to tell stories that make us happier, or do we want to tell stories that are more reflective of the truth? The slave trade, the treatment of the native people, of our native people, the imperialism of Europe, all of it has been washed over, cleaned up, given to you in such a way that it sounds good, when maybe it wasn't always so good, so nice. So when people talk about critical race theory, they're not just talking about like teaching Black history, which I find to be an incredibly odd statement. We definitely need to highlight it more because it's just been ignored for so long. But when you think about who is writing the history books, white men, for the most part, in the United States at least, right? So they wrote it the way they wanted it to sound best to reflect them. Rhetoric, as Plato would say. And as C.S. Lewis observed, he's right. We use rhetoric to change the perception of who we are by choosing what we leave out and what we don't put in, or what we leave out and what we put in, and so on and so forth, and the way that we craft it. Aristotle, as you know, would say that that's not okay. That if you're practicing rhetoric and you're educating and you're persuading people of that story, of that narrative, then you better darn well make sure that it's true. And if you're leaving something out, you need to tell people you're leaving something out, because otherwise that is misinformation. So this concept of fake news is not new. At all. It hasn't been. I realize for you, the last 5 years probably went by pretty quickly. But at the same time, 5 years ago seems like a lifetime ago. Whereas for me, 5 years ago is like yesterday. So it seems like just recently people started talking about fake news, but it's been a complaint since, the before the Common Era, as we say. So when when I saw the C.S. Lewis quotation, I immediately thought about Nick's school district because that's where I live, and they've been having a real battle about it. And I thought, what is a way that we can create this argument without making it so volatile? Like, how can we make it more rhetorically sensitive to the audiences that you're speaking to? And that answer is to not just focus on CRT, to not say we're doing CRT, but instead to say we're teaching real history. We're bringing in more of the history that we are able to verify and leaving out the narratives that may or may not be accurate. So, can rhetoric be used to sort of soften the blow, to massage a message? Yes. Can it be done ethically? Yes. Can you also use rhetoric in the worst way possible to create a reality that is untrue, a history that is untrue, a genealogy that is untrue, and so on? And the answer is yes. So that makes most people say, well, then rhetoric is just a tool that you use, and however you use it is on you. Kind of like a gun, right? Guns don't kill people, people kill people because people are the ones who pick up the gun to use. So if you just don't pick up rhetoric and use it in a bad way, then you can continue to practice rhetoric and do it well and ethically. And that's what Aristotle is talking about as we get into his theory of rhetoric and his practical application of it. We're going to see how that right there, that statement about a good moral character, is key to sharing information and to the skill of knowing in any particular instance all the means of persuasion. You have to understand that that is going on. So the first thing that our book does is I didn't realize how much more editing they did and far less just here's the text from Aristotle, which is helpful, I hope, to you all, because they used to just put big, like sections of text. And I was going through and reading it going, well, wait, this isn't Aristotle. This is the editor telling me what Aristotle said, which is probably better, to be honest with you, for our purposes. So we know that the first thing Aristotle does is he differentiates rhetoric from sophistry. We know this because he said that rhetoric is not a one-time practice. It is an understanding. It is a skill and an art, an understanding of all of what's happening so that you can apply it to every instance. Okay? The sophists, he said, were good for like one shot. And he's right. So he says, how do they differ? Well, not just the ethics, not just the money that we charge, not just the type of teaching that we do for one versus many situations that a person might find themselves in, but also because it starts with dialectic. And as you know, dialectic is where we search for truth. It was the sort of scientific method at the time for finding truth. It's interesting because the book reorganizes a little bit of Aristotle, and that's not a bad thing because he talks about ethics very quickly and says, listen, if you're confused about what is okay and what is not okay, go back to the truth, but then do not use emotion or hatred or anger of any kind to sway a judge or an audience a certain way, because how they feel is so much less important than the truth. Now, that is something we've been struggling with a lot lately, right? Just in the United States alone. So he says that if you move a judge or an audience just by emotion and nothing else, no data, no real reasoning of any kind, if you do that, then you are handling rhetoric poorly, and in fact, you may not be practicing rhetoric at all. All right. So he then says that there's basically three genres, G-E-N-R-E. A genre is a category of speaking in this case. You've probably heard about movie genres, right? Like the Western and the comedy and the sitcom or romantic comedy, and all those different genres of movies and books. There's genres of speeches as well. So he lays out three. The first being, well, I don't know what order he would put them in. I think I know what order I put them in. The first being forensic, where you're talking about something that has already happened, something that's been settled, and you are utilizing what is known and analyzing it by breaking it apart and putting it back together so that your audience has a better idea of how it worked. For the most part, we see this in courtrooms. So some people might refer to the forensic genre as courtroom rhetoric, which makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, the majority of the time, that's where that occurs, that you're talking about something that has already happened, but you're trying to understand how it happened. Okay, so it's really for analysis of events that have passed. So it's about the past. Okay. The second is ceremonial, which I believe that they call epideictic, which I believe is spelled Epideic. I might be a little bit off there, but I think that's actually correct. And epideictic rhetoric is about what's happening in the moment. So this is not about a past event. This is about a present tense sort of situation. And you might be thinking, well, when does that ever happen that you just spontaneously break out in rhetoric when a situation presents itself? And that's not exactly right. What we're talking about is the reason for why you're speaking is happening not necessarily simultaneously, but within the same time frame. And the situation of it is pretty much stagnant and would not change if it was done a year after, generally speaking. So it's about the now. For example, you go to a funeral, there's a dead body in the room, you give a eulogy, right? You go to a school on graduation day, there's a commencement address. You go to an award ceremony, there are introduction speeches or presentational speeches, and then there's also the thank you speeches, the acknowledgement. Excuse me. So it's about what's happening in the moment. You know, you get married, obviously there's a eulogy. So I say that as a very happily married person, by the way. Whoever or whatever your partner is or your life lot, that joke is probably not going to age well, but you know, I might have gotten a giggle out of one or two of you. Obviously, that there would be a wedding toast or an anniversary toast or whatever you're celebrating. The third genre, then, obviously, if we've dealt with the past and the present, deals with the future. And where do we see that? Well, we see that when we're talking about what we should or should not do for the future. Generally, it's policy. Right? Should we do it? Should we not do it? That's the debate. Where does that usually occur? Well, in legislatures across the United States. That's where that happens. Or politicians are supposed to do this, but I don't think that we address it nearly as much as we used to. So if you go into any Congress in any state or at the federal level, if you go into Congress and sit and watch, you'll see there's a very formal way of them debating a bill. Especially if it's a policy bill. And that specific way is set up in another piece that we're going to read later. But for now, what you need to know is that forensic address is about the past, about things that have already happened and analyzing those things. Epideictic or ceremonial is about what's happening in the present and how we're dealing with that right now. And then the third is about the future. What should we do? What should we not do? Policy questions. Okay. If you think about it, though, most of the time, all rhetoric falls into one of those three categories. But I appreciate that Aristotle didn't say all communication is rhetoric, because it's not. And not all persuasion is rhetoric. We can practice the skill or the art of rhetoric when we're persuading people, which, you know, for me is pretty much all the time. That's how I see it. Other people will say, well, those three genres are the only times when rhetoric occurs. So here's how I differentiate between them, because both arguments are compelling. That includes everything, or no, that delineates when there's not rhetoric necessary. And that is this. Remember what I said at the beginning of the semester? Rhetoric is about mass influence. So if you're in Congress talking about what we should do for a policy and there's only one other person in the room and it feels like it's interpersonal communication, it's not, because the policy you're discussing is going to affect everyone. So there's going to be influence on the masses. And that is rhetoric. It's about the public discourse. It's about mass influence. It's not just persuasion or just not persuasion or just public speaking. It is about mass influence. That definitely makes it its own distinct category of communication. So if your mass appeal, mass influence is the goal, and persuasion is what you're attempting to get them to do, then rhetoric ends up in a space for actually a pretty specific job. You should only use it when you want mass to influence a mass amount of people who need you to persuade them of something, or you want to persuade them of something. And that leads us to the question of what persuasion are we talking about? Well, I just said that in Congress, for example, it's should we or should we not do whatever this bill says? In other words, if we pass the bill, we'll do it. If we should not do it, we don't pass the bill, right? That's pretty much the living or very material, definition of stasis. In between the should and should not is that point of stasis where everybody's comfortable because everybody's getting their way. But at some point, a choice needs to be made. And this is where Plato would say the philosopher king makes the choice, and where Aristotle says the people make a choice, thus the voting. All right. So stasis then for Aristotle is not about one or the other being right or wrong or true or false. It's more about, and hang on with me here, it's more about probability. What is most likely true? What is most likely the best thing? What is most probable to be the right choice? So rhetoricians have to make some sort of value estimation about, they need to make some value estimation or qualification about what it is that they're addressing. Is it likely that this is going to happen? If so, why? Well, because it's true and it will save lives, and people like to save lives. That makes it best for the community. And the other side says, no, this is going to actually hinder safety. We should not do this. And that probability gets bounced back and forth until they decide that they're going to make a decision, and that decision is called on by the vote. So probability, not certainty. Certainty is for science. Probability is for reasoning and rhetoric. Okay? Do you remember yesterday I gave the example of being a libertarian about the First Amendment versus being a communitarian? Let me carry that further now to demonstrate how probability is the more important standard when you come to a point of stasis. And here's how it works. As I said yesterday, a libertarian is someone who believes that there is the inalienable right to the First Amendment, and that will never be abridged at all for any reason, because the individual's freedom of speech is the most important thing that you can have. I told you that there's some exceptions to that. For example, hate speech or yelling fire in a theater, or riotous language or seditionist language. Now, why would those be exceptions to this extremely important and fundamental right that we here in the United States claim we have? And the answer to that is pretty simple. Think about it. What do riotous, seditionist, hate speech, and what was the other example that I used? I forget what it was that I said. What do those things have in common? Oh, fire in a theater. Thank you. What those things have in common is that they are a danger to others. So if I scream fire in a crowded theater and there is no fire, what's going to happen? All of the people in the theater are going to run and try to get out the door. They could trample on each other. They could hurt each other. They could potentially die, honestly, all because I screamed a word that I felt I had the right to say, but it hurts more people than it would help. It certainly hurts more people than if I had never said it in the first place. Therefore, that unnecessary communication led to harm of community members. And that's where the communitarian comes in. And the communitarian says we have to think about the surrounding individuals because they have rights too, like a right to live or a right not to be trampled on when somebody just decides to scream a hurtful communication, be that a word or a series of words. So a communitarian tends to think about what's the impact it's going to have on everybody around the person whose right we're trying to protect. And why is that important? That's important because, first of all, it demonstrates the probability in stasis. And secondly, it supports what Aristotle says every good rhetorician has to have, and that is goodwill. I believe that in the book it lists it like in three things. It says it's good moral character, goodwill, and I forget what the third one was, but it was almost the same thing. Like they all sound the same to me, good ethos or whatever it was that he said. Those all three to me speak to the idea of goodwill, that you must have goodwill for your audience. If you don't, they're going to know it, hopefully. Okay, so goodwill is a key component to Aristotle's definition of rhetoric. All right, so where do we get if we're only discussing probabilities? We're discussing likelihoods of probabilities. Great. And so the first thing that Aristotle really wants us to do is to understand reasoning, that there are essentially two kinds for him. One is inductive, the other one is deductive. What is inductive reasoning? It's when we look at a series of points or events or descriptors and we say, okay, what conclusions can we draw from that? So we take all these different examples or these different instances and we come to an overarching conclusion. In deduction, it's almost exactly the opposite. We have a rule or a concept established, and therefore it should be applied in every case. The example I use all the time is a red light. When you come to a red light, what are you supposed to do? I should say traffic light. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Everybody stopped in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania because every light's a red light. I apologize. But a traffic light that happens to be red, what are you supposed to do? Well, you're supposed to stop. Why? Because that is what the law says. That's the rule that we came up with that we believed best helped the community to function. But there are exceptions to that, aren't there? Police officers, ambulances, someone who left too quickly on a yellow. We have exceptions for all of those, right? That doesn't mean that the statement that you stop on red at all times is false. It just means it's probably most likely to be true. I mean, unless you're driving an ambulance or a police car, right? So we know that generally it's true. So we take that rule and we go stand at the corner of National and Grand and we watch all these cars come up to the traffic lights. And when it's red, they stop most of the time. And when it's green, they go most of the time. And when it's yellow, everybody speeds up for some reason I don't understand. So we can sort of predict the likelihood of one thing happening over another. In inductive reasoning, Aristotle says anytime that you use an example, you're using inductive reasoning. You're taking one instance or a couple of instances, a couple of examples, and demonstrating the general principle or idea. Deduction, though, he says, which is the most common and the most reliable, it actually comes in the form of what he calls the syllogism. Now, some of you may have heard of a syllogism before. Some of you may have never heard of a syllogism before. To me, it was sort of core when I was in college, but I don't even know if we teach this anymore. So forgive me if I sound like I'm talking to you as if you're a toddler. But I understand that not everybody gets this particular bit of information in high school or undergrad even. So what is a syllogism? A syllogism is 3 parts. It's considered deductive reasoning because you start with what's known as a major premise. A major premise is something we all know to be true. It's generally accepted to be true. Then there is a minor premise. That minor premise is one instance where we believe that this is happening, where we want to apply the case, apply the major premise to it. The example, the instance, the demonstration, whatever you want to call it. And then finally, there is the conclusion. Now, what's the most famous syllogism? I think most of us know this, but if you've ever heard of syllogisms, you've probably heard this syllogism. That's how I want to word that. The major premise being, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Fantastic. This particular type of argument, if you will, or reasoning is not very helpful. Why? Because if you know the major premise, then you already know the conclusion. So a lot of times people talk about the syllogism in terms of it being a proof of a truth. And so if I can take this truth that you're telling me, and I want to agree with it, all I have to do is find the right major premise and apply it to any specific instance, and boom, I have my conclusion. You stop when you go on red. That car stopped when it came to a red light. Red lights mean stop. It sounds redundant as heck. And I don't know, for years, decades, hundreds of years, philosophers have struggled with that because it is a type of proof, but it's kind of useless, right? And I don't think Aristotle was totally aware of how useless it was in practicalities, but he did later say that the most common form of an argument in communication, in rhetoric, is in fact is not the syllogism, it's an enthymeme. And so for many years, people took that to mean that, well, an enthymeme is just a shortened syllogism. And in some ways that's true, but in a lot of ways it's not. Here's how it works. An enthymeme, that's E-N-T-H-Y-M-E-M-E. And let me be clear about this. All these terms I'm spelling are in your book. But I just feel weird not having like a chalkboard or a whiteboard or something to write it down. So these are all in your book, but I want to spell them for you for that reason. So an enthymeme is an argument that you make where you assume some of the premises are already agreed upon as true. If you've taken argumentation, another way to think about this is we assume that we all agree on the evidence or the warrant even, and we can make this claim. And everybody's going to agree with us because we assume everybody agrees that the premises are true. The assumptions. There's presumption, if you will. All right. So what's wrong with that? Well, there's nothing wrong with an enthymeme if everybody is actually on the same page. And there's certainly nothing wrong with enthymeme if you're using them to make an argument and people who understand rhetoric understand an enthymeme. Okay, you're cutting corners there, dude. I disagree with you. Or, yeah, that sounds about right. If I agree to all of the premises that you're assuming to be true, you're supposing them to be true, then I can agree with the final conclusion or the claim of your argument. Here's an example of that, of an enthymeme. So if I had a syllogism that says, Um, the United States of America was attacked, and therefore we should attack back. Okay? That's my claim. They hit us, we should hit them. There are a couple of things that are being assumed or presumed in there. The presumption is that, one, I agree that whoever it is we're going to attack is the cause of the attack on us. Number two, that I believe in sort of a retribution or revenge scenario of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, or some form of that. It also assumes that I agree that the answer to violence is violence, or that the answer to war is war. And it doesn't matter what side of the fence you are on all those. I don't agree with any of them. So for me, when back in 2001, when you guys weren't born yet or whatever, I'm still having a hard time with that one, with you guys being as young as you are. I don't want to assume that you understand it. But back immediately following the attack on the Twin Towers in New York, they immediately said we need to attack Afghanistan. And if you don't agree with that, if you're not with us, then you're against us. Yes, George W. Bush said both of those things. That's not in dispute. And most people don't have a problem with that. But for those of us who are going, wait, shouldn't we figure out who attacked us, where they are, not just kill some Afghanis because we feel like it? Like, shouldn't we take a beat, figure out what we're going to do? I'm not saying don't go to war. I'm just saying maybe we wait a minute before we do it. Others said, come on, we don't need to wait. We know that Afghanistan is hiding Osama bin Laden and so on. But the idea that if you don't agree with one of the United States' policies, that therefore you are against the United States, came out of that. And that was very frustrating. Being an American who loves her country and supports the military and is the daughter of war vets and or granddaughter of war vets in my case, I'm appalled by that statement, right? So what happened? Why was the first argument accepted that if you're not with us, you're against us, and we should go over and attack Afghanistan? Because we did, of course. And the answer to that is very simple. The people who were making the decisions overwhelmingly agreed that we should attack Afghanistan. Now, whether they agreed it for all the same reasons or not is pretty irrelevant. They agreed on the final policy. Why do I say it's irrelevant? Because I can sit here and explain to you all the enthymematic reasons, yes, that's a word, enthymematic reasons why I didn't agree with that action. And it won't matter, because all that people decide on is that final claim. We should attack Afghanistan. Vote aye, nay. The ayes have it. We attack Afghanistan. And that's how democracy works. Remember, I told you that our government and our power system was going to be inextricably tied to rhetoric. And that's one of the reasons why, right there. And so for many of us, a few years after the attack, it was a struggle. We were having a hard time because you couldn't say that you are a pacifist or that you don't believe in war, or you believe it exists, obviously, but you don't believe in it as an answer, or you believe in it as an answer, but only after a bunch of other things were tried first. Like, you couldn't explain yourself. It was just, you were against it. You're bad. You're unpatriotic. Get out. You're not with us. You're anti-American, un-American. Choose your words. Because we put everything into those binaries without considering that people might agree with the final outcome, but not agree with the reasoning for it. But when you're talking just about should we or shouldn't we, what difference does that make? You have the number of votes that you need to do the action that you want to take. I hope that makes sense. So how do we then know about these assumptions, these premises, these presumptions? Well, that's pretty simple. All All rhetoric relies on your ability to demonstrate the truth of your statements, the veracity, the goodness in your claims with proofs. The first kind of proof is, I believe your book is calling them inartistic and artistic. They're also known as, I forget what the other term is that we use. I think your book uses inartistic and artistic, so we'll stick with that. If there's a different word, let me know if you're confused. An inartistic proof is one that does not need to be created. It exists outside of the human being, right? It's science. It's stuff you can go out and find empirically. What do I mean by empirically? Well, empiricism, which we're going to read about much later down the line, but empiricism is anything you can learn through your five senses: sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. Those five senses. If it comes to you through those five senses, then it's an inartistic proof. You don't have to make it up. It's there. All right. Aristotle would tell you that you don't debate science. You use science to debate morals. Okay. And that's true. So inartistic proofs are things like, we all agree that the sky is blue. Now, why the sky is blue is because it reflects the water. The sun reflects the water on the earth, which is 80% or 70% water. Therefore, it reflects the color blue because it's clear water on top of clear air, and those two reflect blue somehow. Does that matter? Not really. I could go outside and see that the sky is, on the majority, blue. Okay? So that's pretty much an inartistic proof. It's outside of me, it's external to humans, but there are things that humans can experience through their five senses in an empirical manner. The type that we're interested in are artistic proofs. Artistic proofs are created by the human, by the speaker for the most part, according to Aristotle. We use inartistic proofs to make artistic proofs. Okay? The other words, it just came to my head, were inartificial and artificial. So whenever I say inartistic, if you're reading it as inartificial, that's fine. If I'm saying artistic and you're reading it as artificial, that is fine as well. Both are acceptable. Okay. Artistic or artificial proofs have to be created by the human being by using the inartistic or inartificial proofs. There are three artistic proofs, three artificial proofs that are required when you're trying to persuade. And you have to have all three of these according to Aristotle. And if you have all three artistic proofs without having any inartistic proofs, then you fail. You must be using them, and you'll see why in a minute. What are the three artistic proofs? Those are ethos, pathos, and logos, right? And ethos, he says, is not just ethics or are you a good person. It's that idea of goodwill that I talked about, that you demonstrate goodwill for your audience and that you give them the sense that all of the information you're giving them is all they need in order to agree with you or to do what you want them to do, that you are taking care of them. There's a trustworthiness based on, yes, your good moral character and who you are as an ethical being in the world, but also because you've established that. Obviously, it's a little bit hard to establish your knowledge and your credibility if you don't have inartistic or inartificial proofs. I mean, I can make up anything I want, but if I can't show that to you or demonstrate that to you empirically, it's probably not my best argument, nor should you listen to it, to be quite frank. Okay? The second, logos, a lot of people say, oh, that means logic. Well, unfortunately for them, in the Greek language, logos actually means word. What Aristotle was trying to say was how you express logic and reasoning through your words. That's what logos is. It's not just logic. It's literally the use of language and expressing the logical argument to your audience. Okay? The third is pathos. And no, this is not just emotion, but this is what Aristotle was talking about when he said you cannot just get someone riled up and angry or full of hate or full of sympathy or fear, get them scared, and then persuade them. That is not rhetoric. It's not ethical. It's not okay. They have to come to the decision without being put into a different mindset completely and listen to what you're saying as well as how you're saying it. Yes, you can sometimes see that people will use pathos, but hopefully they use it in a good way, which would be to say, for example, the best example is what's not okay. Probably my best example there are the ASPCA commercials with Sarah McLachlan, and now a different actress is doing it. I can't remember her name. For a while, David Duchovny was doing these ads where they just show you really sad pictures of dogs and cats and say, these animals are being abused. Please help save them. Donate money. Okay, I've got several questions here. Number one, how did the dogs and cats end up in that condition in the first place? Second of all, the reason that's important is because perhaps there's somewhere else we need to be shutting down a puppy mill or a science lab or whatever if we truly believe in this. So I'm not sure how I feel about that. Secondly, those animals that are on the commercial are fine. They are probably getting the best care possible. Sorry, that's true. You put a dog or a cat or something on television, it's being pampered to death not because of money, but because they want you to see the sad, pathetic, one-eyed cat or beat up dog. They can certainly take pictures of those things when they go out to try to save animals. On the bright side, that means they're doing something. But on the not so bright side, it's just a ploy to get me to send money to a place that I don't know what they're doing with the money. I mean, you're saving these cats and dogs. How? What exactly are you doing with them? Because I volunteer at my local humane society and they're not receiving a check from the SPCA. That's where I'm putting my money, my time, whatever trade I'm in. So those commercials are probably the most obvious. And if you want to hear something truly pathetic, my family always had dogs. We had family pets, dogs. And when I moved into an apartment and moved far, far away from home, I decided to get a cat. My first cat really was difficult to deal with and needed to be outdoors. And so a friend of mine took him when I moved from Oklahoma to Missouri. When I lived in Columbia, Missouri, and up in Minnesota, I did not have any pets. But when I moved down here, I realized I wanted a cat again in my apartment. Now, why not a dog? Well, because I didn't feel that an apartment was big enough. I'm not home that much. At the time, I was at the office like I'm at home now. Like it was like 24/7 at the office. And that's just cruel to do to a dog. But, a cat, they can handle you coming home for 6 or 7 hours a night to sleep because they can take care of themselves for the most part. So I got a cat and I loved him to death. Unfortunately, I got him when he was about 6 years old, and his previous owners had him living outside with his front claws clipped. Don't even get me started on claw clipping. But you guys don't need to know my stance on animal rights or anything. But the idea is that after being out in the climate, the environment outside, and other cats and such, by the time I adopted him, rescued him, he had cuts and bruises all over his head. He was missing fur. He had scratched himself, or some other animal had scratched him. It was just a terrible sight. So I took him in. I made him an indoor cat, and he lived 3 very plush luxury years with me. Unfortunately, he got a kidney disease that a friend of mine paid for the surgery to fix the first time, and it failed. And so we decided it was probably best just to let him go. And so I have never had to put an animal down in my life. They've always died naturally on our hands. So I was a little devastated to be making that decision and signing the piece of paper that says you agree to put your cat to death. Just horrifying. And a friend of mine went with me to do this because she knew I probably wouldn't do well with it. And so there is my cat, scared to death. I'm holding him as best I can, trying to tell him it was going to be okay soon. And on the Muzak in the veterinary clinic I was in came the song Arms of the Angel by Sarah McLachlan. Now, if you don't know the relationship between Arms of the Angel and putting pets to sleep, go watch the ASPCA commercials from the late 90s and early 2000s, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And my friend just bolted out of the room and screamed, "Get that off of the radio right now." So not only do the commercials get to me, but now the songs that they're using in them got to me in a very different situation. It's horrible. That's horrible to do to someone. You should never make someone feel that guilty, especially when they're doing something for a pet that they love, or a person that they love, or a community that they love, a university that they love, whatever. It is not okay to appeal to that. That type of appeal to pathos, Aristotle says flat out, don't do it. That's not okay. It's not right. If you cannot get somebody to change their mind or be persuaded by your arguments, your inartistic and artistic proofs, and your good character, then you should not be practicing rhetoric. And that was really one of his biggest problems with the sophists as well. All right. So we know what an inartistic and artistic proof is. We know what a syllogism is. We know what an enthymeme is. We know that the enthymeme is the most common type of argument made by human beings. And we know that if we don't go into a persuasion situation with good intent and goodwill for our audience, that they will not do what we want them to do. I also liken this to another sort of mass media messaging problem, which is with prescription medications. If you're like me and you have like 4 autoimmune diseases, I say like, it's actually 4. You have 4 autoimmune diseases, you're trying to keep them in remission, or you're trying to control them, like diabetes and then sarcoidosis. If you're whatever it is that you're doing, you take a lot of medications sometimes. So we're talking 15, 16 prescriptions every day. And I'll listen to a commercial for one of the prescriptions I'm on, and they tell you all the potential side effects, right? And they tell you that if you need help paying for this, that the company might be able to help you pay for it. I mean, they give you every reason to not want that prescription. And what's wrong with that is that you might be keeping a prescription from people who actually would benefit from it. But we're so busy covering our butts legally, or using emotion, or trying to get people to ignore the negative potential of something, that we just throw it out there. We speak it really quickly, or we bury it underneath a lot of information. And that to me does not suggest that anybody has goodwill for me in their mind when they're making those commercials. No company can tell me that they care about me. Okay. And you're talking about someone who has an insulin pump and has been doing this for a long time and has dealt with the mechanics of it, as well as prescription side effects, as well as help paying for these things when you have full insurance, all of it. All of it. I have dealt with all of it. And I got to tell you, there is not one company out there that deals in medical equipment and drugs that makes me feel like they care about me, because that's not in the job description. If I don't have my insulin pump, I'm dead. Pretty quickly, I would imagine, less than a year, knowing how I take care of myself. If I didn't have insulin, I would be dead within weeks. So there's, they don't have to care about me. They don't have to show me goodwill to persuade me to take an insulin pump and put insulin in it and take my insulin every month or every day. They don't have to, because I need them more than they need me. They don't need to persuade me because I already need to get it anyway. So that's what I'm talking about with goodwill. Like, even at that level, it never feels like they have goodwill for me. I'm always feeling like when I went to the dentist, as we've talked about my tooth missing, he said, well, we can put a little flipper in there. I don't know why they call it a flipper, but it's a temporary tooth. And I said, okay, how much is that? And he's like, $500. And I'm like, I'm not that vain. I can live without a tooth for 6 months and get my permanent one put in and not spend $500 freaking dollars on a flipper, whatever that is, right? I was kind of irritated by that, because you're talking about something that's going to be barely useful to you and is strictly cosmetic. And he said, if you have a confidence problem, then I would recommend you get it. If you don't worry about it. And apparently I don't have a confidence problem. I guess that's where that came about. So I don't really trust a lot of the messages that I hear. I do not assume that they have my goodwill, that they have goodwill on my benefit at the forefront, even if they say it. I don't believe it instantly. And Aristotle says that's a normal reaction from an audience. And that's why we have to listen. So now, the final thing I need to address with you all after all that is what happens when the logic fails. What happens if we're driving down the street and we come to a light and it turns red and the person behind us slams into us because they did not stop like they were supposed to? Does that mean that the claim is wrong? Does that mean the statement that red lights are where, make people stop when they're driving on streets in the United States? No, it doesn't make it wrong. It makes it an exception. However, if instead of that example, we went with something like, you don't want to take medicine from company 12 because they do everything wrong. Well, what do you mean they do everything wrong? Well, every experience I've had with them has been bad. Okay? So one person has had bad experiences with company 12, therefore company 12 is evil and should be put away, right? No. That's called a fallacy in reasoning. Okay? When you have a flaw in the reasoning behind why something should or should not be accepted as true, it's called a fallacy, and there are literally thousands of them, most of them named in Latin, by the way. So I will not make you learn those individually, but there's some small discussion about that in the book if you want to read more about that. And if you want to learn about those specifically, feel free to take argumentation with me next semester. So there you go. That's what you have here. Or with Heather or the Doctors Morris, whoever's teaching it. I believe I'm teaching it in the fall, but whoever's teaching it will teach you all about those different fallacies, and you should certainly feel free to turn towards that class for those. I will not be testing you or grading you on those myself individually. So what did we learn today? Well, we learned the basic skeletal outline of Aristotle's argument about what rhetoric is. You've been exposed to the first 3 books of the rhetoric, and it certainly we're not giving you the comprehensive. We could study Aristotle for an entire semester and maybe get through the rhetoric and the politics and possibly the poetics. I don't know. I have never taught that class, at least not yet. But that would be fascinating for me, for you, much less interesting because you'd have to read a lot more of Aristotle's original works, and that could be very, very difficult. So I hope this sums it up for you a little bit. Any questions that you have for me, feel free to put on the discussion board or send me an email or a text or whatnot. And as a last note, I will have the grading done on all of your discussions that have been due prior to this week. Those will be done probably tonight or tomorrow. So be on the lookout if you're still waiting for those. Those of you who turned them in early or submitted them early, I've already graded them. So you should have a grade. All right, everybody, if you don't have grades as you're supposed to by Wednesday, definitely email me. I'm sorry, today's Tuesday, tomorrow's Wednesday. By Thursday morning, definitely email me because you should have them all by then. All right, take care of you. And this is my last video for this week, I promise. I shouldn't say that. See you soon.